Good morning. How are we doing today? It's Saturday morning, and I didn't really expect to be able to stream today, but here we are, so I think that's a good thing. I know it's early. This was an unplanned stream. It will probably be a short stream because this entire book is only 148 pages. And so I'm reading 50 pages to be a third. So yeah, this will be a nice short little stream. So if anybody pops in, great. It's great to have you. If anybody's watching this later, thank you for watching later. Oh my goodness. Tomas, thank you so much for resubbing. Aw, thank you so much. How are you? It's good to see you. Happy afternoon, I think, for you, so I hope you're doing well. Yeah, I just planned to read a little bit of this. This is the book that Nancy Drew number 9 is based off of, which is Danger on Deception Island. So I plan to just kind of read this. I'm going to move my mic real quick. I'm glad you're doing all right. I'm doing all right as well. Work's been a little stressful, but everything else is going well, so I can't complain too much. So Nancy Drew game number 9, Danger on Deception Island, is based loosely on this book. So as per my tradition of going through the books, so we can compare and contrast book to game, I'm going to read a little bit of this one. So before we jump into the book, I wanted to read the description on the back, which says, treacherous fog and sneaker waves are just the beginning of Nancy's adventure. Katie Firestone, champion kayaker and owner of a whale-watching tour boat, has invited George, along with Nancy, Ned, and Bess, to vacation in Seabreak, north of San Francisco. But when Katie's boat is vandalized, suspicion falls on fisherman Holt Scotto, who may be trying to run Katie out of business. The menace doesn't stop there. A bike accident, a stalker, danger at an abandoned lighthouse, and a terrifying kayak trip lead Nancy to a hidden sea cave. Inside, Nancy discovers a dangerous secret. Soon, her fearless instincts plunge her deeper into trouble, and it will take all her courage, daring, and wits to get herself and her friends out of it alive. That's very, very dramatic. All right. Let me take a sip of water, and we'll just jump in. Okay. I feel like the water bottle is just like crackle, crackle, crackle. When did that ever happen? In this book is obviously the beginning. Okay. Whispers in the Fog by Carolyn Keene. Chapter 1. A Surprise Visitor. The California sun felt warm on Nancy Drew's slender back. She stood beside the car she had picked up at the San Francisco airport and watched her friend George Fane run up the steps of the small wood frame house. The house, the sky, and Nancy's eyes were all the same shade of blue. It had been a long flight and a long drive, and Nancy was happy to be out of the car at last. "You made it," said a tall girl, running out of the house and grabbing George in a big hug. "Perfect instructions, as always," George replied with a grin. "Guys, this is Katie Firestone. Katie, these are my best friends from home. Nancy Drew, my cousin, Bess Marvin, and Ned Nickerson." Katie ushered them into her house and showed George her room. "I wish I could put you all up," she said generously, "but it would get pretty cramped." An attractive 20-year-old with brown hair, she had an athlete's body, tall, lithe, and strong. Nancy and her friends had come from River Heights to a spot on the Northern California coast near the tiny town of Seabreak. George had met Katie at a world sea kayaking competition and persuaded Nancy, Bess, and Ned to come to Seabreak for a vacation. To earn money, Katie piloted her own whale-watching tourist boat, and January was a perfect month to watch the migrating whales. They were all looking forward to seeing the whales and to training with Katie for sea kayaking. "I love your house," Bess said. "It's so cute." Although Bess Marvin was George's cousin, they looked nothing alike. Bess had pale blue eyes and straw blonde hair without the reddish tones of Nancy's. George was slim and athletic with dark hair and eyes. Bess's figure was fuller. "Well, look quick," Katie said with a toss of her long, straight, dark hair. "I've been working on it for 2 days in honor of your visit. I'm not the best housekeeper in the world, and things get out of hand quickly." "It looks fine to me," Ned chimed in. "So when do we start the kayak training? I'm ready." Ned was also tall, with clean-cut, good looks. As captain of his school's football team, he was a natural athlete. He'd been whitewater kayaking and had come on the trip to get some experiencing kayaking in the surf. "It's really too late for a workout now," Katie said, "but I've packed a picnic. I thought we'd bike around the area so I could show you some of my favorite places. It's really beautiful here." "We'll need to go into town to rent bikes," George said. "No, you won't," Katie said. "I've got 7 or 8 in the garage. Biking's a big hobby of mine, and it's great exercise to keep me in shape. I pick them up at yard sales and flea markets for nothing, rehaul them, and fix them up till they're good as new. Go on out and take your pick. Ned, I've even got a couple of men's bikes I keep for friends." It took just a few minutes to pick bikes. From the back fender of Katie's red bike hung a sign with the name Firestone Whale Watching and Katie's phone number written on it. Nancy followed Katie as they rode single file along the winding 2-lane highway. To the left were fields of golden grasses leading to the Pacific Ocean, which was shining a bright blue in the late afternoon sun. To the right, more fields of green and gold ended at the foot of enormous hills covered with dark forests of redwoods and firs. After a few more miles, Katie led them down a narrow path toward the rugged coastal bluff. They parked their bikes and leaned them against a couple of cypress trees. "Now there's a sign you don't see in River Heights," Ned said. Nancy followed his gaze to the short post topped with a rustic flatwood board. "Please don't shout," Nancy read aloud. "Sea lions use this beach as a nursery. Loud noises might disturb the mothers and their pups." She looked down at the foot of the bluff. Beyond the sandy shore were large outcroppings of rock that formed a network of small islands and jetties in the water. Sunbathing on the rocks just a few yards from the shore were a dozen sea lions, some with babies snuggled next to them. "Let's go down on the beach," Katie said. "Everybody grab something. Just leave the bikes up here. They'll be okay." Bess and George grabbed their backpacks and followed Katie down the wooden plank steps secured into the rocky side of the bluff. Ned unstrapped the picnic basket from his bike, and he and Nancy made their way down to join the others at the bottom of the steps. "Let's go over to that side of the beach," Katie said, pointing away from the sea lion nursery. "There's a natural stone picnic table over there." Katie led them to a large rock with a flat top. Around it, boulders served as stools and benches. "I love this," Nancy said. "It feels so private." The stretch of beach felt like a large room. The bluff reached up about 15 feet behind them. Beside them, a tower of rock climbed higher than the bluff. About 1/3 of the rock was anchored in the sandy beach. The rest rose up from the ocean. The rock was covered with thousands of pale gray and dark blue striped shells. They looked as if they'd been glued onto the rock in a mixed-up jumble. Bess reached out and touched one of the shells. "What are these?" she asked. "Mussels," Katie answered, taking paper plates and napkins out of her backpack. "That whole rock's just one big mussel bed." "Hey, look at this," George called out. She was crouched at the edge of the water near another, smaller boulder. Nancy and Ned joined her to look down into a small pool of water completely surrounded by sand and rock. "A tide pool," Nancy said, leaning down to get a closer look. It was a miniature ocean, alive with small fish and sea cucumbers. A starfish sprawled across an underwater ledge. Crabs scurried across the shells lining the pool's bottom, and flower-like sea urchins fluttered just beneath the water's surface. "It's so beautiful here," Bess said. "We've got mountains behind us and ocean in front of us." "Yeah," George said, unwrapping a sandwich. "Mountain biking behind us, sea kayaking in front of us." She turned to Katie. "So when does the training begin? Ned and I are eager to get into our cockpits and start paddling." "Jenna is due tomorrow," Katie answered, taking a bite from a juicy peach. "Jenna Devlin. George, I think you met her at a World Trials once. She's coming down from Seattle to train with us." "Don't forget the whale watching," Bess reminded them. "That's what I'm here for." "Don't worry," Katie told her with a smile. "We'll definitely get some of that in. In fact, you may be my last whale watchers. I'm thinking about closing the business." "What do you mean?" Nancy asked, opening a soda. "Is the business not as much fun as you thought it would be?" Actually, it's wonderful, Katie said, gazing down at the water drifting over the sand. I'm not busy all the time, just during the migration, so it gives me plenty of time to kayak. And I like the tourists who come to see the whales. It's fun meeting people from all over. So what's the problem? Ned asked. Why are you thinking about closing up shop? Katie reached into a bag for a few chips, stared at them, then dropped them one by one onto her plate. For a minute, Nancy thought the young woman was going to cry. Then Katie surprised her. She looked up. She looked up, her dark eyes fiery with anger. Because I may not have any choice, that's why, she said, her words popping like little explosions in the air. Someone's trying to force me out of business, she continued. I've gotten anonymous notes, threatening phone calls. It's driving me nuts. She pulled her head up high. But I don't want to throw in the towel. I want to hold on as long as I can. Maybe they'll give up. Who? Nancy asked. Who do you think is doing that? And why? Bess added. I don't know for sure, Katie said. This is a very small town. It's been a sleepy little fishing village for over a century. That means many generations of fishermen, Nancy guessed, and they're pretty protective of their territory, I'll bet. You've got it, Katie said with a nod. They believe they've inherited these waters for their family trade. And they're not thrilled to be sharing their territory with an outsider like me. After all, I've only been here 5 years. I'm still an alien. I might as well have dropped from Mars as far as the locals are concerned. Why should they care? Ned asked. You're not fishing. You're not in competition with them. I know, but they think I'm interfering anyway, Katie said. They think taking a boat of tourists out for a day's excursion disrupts the waters and cuts down on their catch. She squared her shoulders. And it might, she said, but I've got just as much right to those waters as they do. I live here too. And you should be able to make a living too, Bess said, placing an arm around Katie's shoulders. It seems to me that dozens of whales swimming through the water makes the disruption anyway, George said. Adding a whale-watching excursion to the mix shouldn't make that much difference. Right, Ned agreed. After all, it's only a few months a year. That's not too much to ask. I expect it's more than just the excursions, Nancy said. It's the whole idea of tourists coming into town, strangers wandering around, cars parked everywhere. Do you suspect anyone in particular? Well, there's this third-generation local named Holt Scotto, Katie answered. He's sort of the leader of the fishermen. He has the biggest boat and seems to be the one who makes all the decisions. If he's not causing the trouble I'm having, he has to know about it and who's responsible. Nancy can help, George said. Remember, I told you she's a world-famous detective. I'm sure she'd be happy to look into it for you, wouldn't you, Nancy? Nancy smiled at Katie and George, saying, Sure, I could. No, thank you, Katie said, cutting Nancy off. I appreciate it, but I'd rather figure it out for myself, she added with a tight smile. I think I can win these guys over eventually. She started gathering up soda cans and trash. Well, we need to get back home if we're going to beat the fog and go on a sunset cruise. As they cleaned up the area, Nancy noticed the huge bank of fog over the water. While they were eating, it had hung in the distance, an enormous gray cloud that rested on the ocean, swallowing up the horizon. Now it was moving slowly toward them. Katie followed Nancy's gaze. As if reading her thoughts, Katie said, I love the fog. It's so mysterious. It will touch the shore by nighttime and crawl clear into the hills. It looks so solid from here, Bess said, almost like a silver wall. But when you're in it, it's just wisps, Katie murmured. 1 second you can see for miles, the next you see nothing but fog. Nancy felt a chill shimmy down her back. What was that, she wondered. She reached for her sweatshirt. The sun's going down, she assured herself. It's getting cooler. But she couldn't shake the odd feeling. There's something funny going on here, she thought. I wonder what we're getting into. On the bike ride back to Katie's, Nancy thought about her new friend's predicament. She wished Katie would accept her help. Nancy decided to keep her eyes and ears open just in case. When they got back to Katie's house, they put their bikes and the picnic stuff away. After freshening up and grabbing sweaters, they followed Katie onto a long finger of land stretching into the ocean. There, in a boathouse, Katie's boat, the Ripper, bounced on the gently rippling tide. Katie led them up the ramp to the deck, which was partly open and partly enclosed with windows along the sides. She stopped with a gasp when she stepped on the deck. "Look what they did!" she yelled. "They trashed her!" It's end of chapter 1. Everyone's so energetic, athletic, and handsome. Definitely not millennials. Bess is a total millennial. Hey, little bro. I liked the music. Nice pink. Did not Pikachu, little bro. First time the stream time is perfect, and I'm still late. It's okay. How are you doing? My nose is kind of runny. Excuse me. Oh, thank you so much for the bits. And thank you for that. Bookstream. Thank you for that follow. Figgy. Okay. So, first comparisons. This takes place in California and not in the San Juan Islands. Katie Firestone has long, dark brown hair, according to the book. Jenna Devlin doesn't live in town. She's coming from Seattle. So it's like Jenna Devlin's in the right place, but I don't know. First initial comparisons. Okay, chapter 2. Open up. Nancy ran up the ramp and shuddered as she glanced around the deck of the Ripper. Cushions were thrown on the floor, foam stuffing spilling out of their slashed green and white striped covers. Sunshades had been ripped from their hardware, leaving ugly gashes in the wooden window casings. Coils of heavy rope had been hacked into fraying pieces. Katie ran across the deck and down the steps to the cabin. Nancy and Ned followed her. Nancy stepped gingerly over the mess in the galley. Cupboards were splintered with the remaining pieces dangling from broken hinges. Napkins, spoons, and bananas littered the floor. Leaning against the galley wall, Katie slowly sunk to the floor. "This must have happened while we were on our picnic," she said. "I came down here just before we left. How could they do this?" she asked, her eyes filling with tears. "Hang-up phone calls are one thing, but this?" Bess and George crowded into the small space. "I'm so sorry, Katie," George said, going over to comfort her friend. "Please, let Nancy help. I told you before, she's a real ace as a detective." "She's solved cases all over the world," Ned added, smiling fondly at Nancy and then at Katie. "I know she can figure this one out." "And we'll all help," Bess declared. "We'll find out who's doing this and put an end to it, won't we, Nancy?" "I'd be glad to look into it," Nancy said. She liked Katie and thought her new friend was getting a bad deal. "Okay, I believe you," Katie said. "Maybe I do need help. I'd love to have the opinion of someone from the outside on this. Someone who's more objective and not all emotional about everything." "Well, you've got 4 someones right here," Bess said. "We'll get to the bottom of this." Katie and George went back to the house to call the sheriff. Nancy, Ned, and Bess stayed to watch the boat. "Look around for clues," Nancy told the others, "but don't disturb anything." Katie and George returned shortly. "Seabreak is too small for its own police force," Katie told them. "I called Sheriff Harvey. He works this part of the county. He lives in the next town, but he'll be here soon." While they all looked around, Nancy questioned Katie about the notes and the phone calls, but didn't learn anything that she thought could help. Katie said Sheriff Harvey had investigated, but there just weren't any clues to pursue. He talked to Holt Scotto and some of the other Seabreak fishermen, but they all claimed to know nothing. "What's this?" Nancy wondered, crouching to get a better look. It was the torn fragment of what looked like a business card that had fallen under one of the window seats. The words Lone Motel were printed on it in fancy type. The line below read Way 1. In the corner, someone had written the number 7 in ink. "Do you think that was dropped by one of the vandals?" Bess asked. "As I said before, I'm not the best housekeeper in the world," Katie said, "but I'm better than this," she added with a wry smile and a sweep of her arm. "That piece of paper could have been here for months, dropped by one of my whale watchers." When was the last time you did a real cleaning job on this place? Nancy asked, and how many people have been on board since? Oh, probably 3 weeks, Katie said. I've had a few nearly full boats since then, maybe 30 or 40 people. I can find out exactly when I check my records. That means fingerprinting's probably not going to be much help, Ned concluded. Right, Nancy? You're probably right, Nancy said. She drew a copy of the business card fragment in a small notebook she carried in her jeans pocket. When Sheriff Harvey arrived, Katie introduced him to the others, briefly mentioning Nancy's reputation as a detective. He gave Nancy a curious smile. Nancy pointed out the business card fragment, which he picked up with a tissue and pocketed. He agreed that fingerprinting would probably not be much help, but took a few impressions from the places where the damage was the greatest. It's gotta be Scotto or some of his buddies, Katie told the sheriff. Who else would do this? I'll talk to them again, Miss Firestone, Sheriff Harvey said, reassuring her. And I'll check out these prints, but it could have just been some kids up from the city looking for trouble. We've had a few reports up and down the coast about similar incidents. Maybe some of these prints will match the ones taken from the other boats and cottages that have been vandalized. Meanwhile, you be sure to let me know if anything else happens. As he started to leave the boat, he turned. All of you be careful. Don't take it on yourselves to be snooping around, he said, looking at Nancy. After the sheriff left, George offered to help Katie clean up the boat. I need to go into town and pick up a few things I forgot to pack, Bess said. Then I'll come back and help you. I'll drive you in, Nancy said. I want to look around a little anyway while the trail is still fresh. You two aren't going into enemy territory without me, Ned insisted, taking Nancy's hand. Thanks for all the help with the cleanup, George said sarcastically, her mouth twisted into a half smile. Let them go, Katie said. From what you've said, Nancy's the best. Let her get to work. I'm just kidding, George said, grinning. But remember what the sheriff said, she warned her friends. Be careful. Seabreak was one of the tiny towns dotting the coastal bluffs from San Francisco north to the Oregon border. It had old wood frame houses with small lawns, a tiny bakery, a bare essentials grocery store. There were no tourist souvenir shops, not even a gas station. Katie was right, Bess murmured. This is a sleepy little town. There was a natural wharf created by a rocky shoal along the shore. A long pier jutted out from the harbor. Several fishing boats bobbed in the water along the pier. The sun had set, but the sky still glowed a pale peach color. Thin spikes of fog filled the air. An old-fashioned diner perched on the edge of the bluff above the wharf. Ned parked the car in the diner parking lot. Nancy led Bess and Ned down the rickety wooden plank steps to the shore. Then they strolled along the pier to a string of fishing boats. As they walked closer, they could see the bustling activity of the boat owners. One fisherman noticed Nancy and her friends and stepped into the pier from his small boat. Can I help ya? He asked. No, Nancy said quickly. We're just enjoying the sunset. It's a beautiful evening. Are you going to do some night fishing? The man stared at Nancy. His eyes seemed not to blink at all. She tried to match him, locking into his gaze. When he finally spoke, she realized she'd been holding her breath. Yep, he said. Say, you're not locals. Are you up from the city? Tourists, maybe? We're visiting a friend, Nancy said, smiling. One of your neighbors. You probably know her. Katie Firestone? The man's eyelids lowered a little as he looked from Nancy to Ned to Bess and then back to Nancy. Yes, I know her, he said slowly. The whale watcher. Well, actually, we're here to do some sea kayak training with her, Nancy said. Right, Ned? She turned to him, giving him the cue to join in the conversation. That's right, Ned said, taking a step forward. Hi, I'm Ned Nickerson. He held out his hand. Nice to meet you, the man said. He shook Ned's hand but didn't offer his name. I'm really looking forward to the sea kayaking, Ned said, giving the fisherman one of his classic broad smiles. Katie's a world-class athlete, you know, Ned continued. Seabreak is lucky to have such a winner living here. Lucky, the man said. Well, some people have different views of luck than others. What's good luck to some might be bad luck to others. Enjoy your stay, but be careful of the sneakers. Nancy looked down at her shoes and then looked back, but the fisherman had disappeared into his boat. Let's go back to that diner, Nancy said, looking up at the small building on the bluff above them. There were only a few people in the diner. When the waitress brought over the suppers they ordered, Nancy asked her a few questions, but the young woman seemed suspicious and unwilling to talk. Finally, Nancy, Ned, and Bess went back to the inn where they were staying. I wish we were staying at Katie's with George, Bess said when they got into the room she was sharing with Nancy. The inn is nice, but it would be more fun to kick around that cool house. She doesn't really have the space for all of us, Nancy reminded Bess, especially with the other sea kayaker coming in tomorrow. Besides, Katie's house is only about a mile down the road, Ned added. She said we can come and go anytime we want. I intend to take her up on that. I'm showing up early tomorrow morning to see if I can't talk her into some kayaking. She told us to come over for breakfast about 8:30 or 9, Nancy reminded him. Great, I'll meet you downstairs, Ned said, 8:15. Ned left for his room. Nancy looked out the window thinking about the evening's investigation. I wonder how the boat cleanup went, Bess said, plunking down on the bed by the little fireplace. I wonder if Katie and George found any more clues. I doubt it. Nancy sank into a plush green chair. I'm sure George would have called if they had. She pulled the copy of the business card fragment from her pocket and studied it for a moment. Do you really think that's anything, Nancy? Bess asked. As Katie said, it could have been dropped by any one of dozens of people. I know, Nancy agreed, but right now it's all we... Hey! A booming voice exploded like a cannon from the hall outside their door. Nancy's words caught in her throat as Bess ran to her side trembling. Nancy's pulse seemed to beat in rhythm to the pounding on the door, and the whole room seemed to shake. Hey! The man yelled again. Are you in there? Open this door now! That's the end of chapter 2. It's always weird how, like, in the books, at least a lot of the books that I've been reading so far that the games are based off of, Nancy's usually not by herself. She's, like, with all her friends. And it's curious to me that, that she's, like, with all of her friends in the books and usually by herself in the games. So, I mean, I know some games are the exception to that. You've got, like, Alibi and Ashes and Ransom of the Seven Ships and Last Train to Bloom Canyon when she's with the Hardys and stuff like that. It would have been hard to do in-game. Yeah, you're probably right. It's like you cut the amount of characters and there's less, like, moving pieces. So I suppose you're right, but... Right, exactly. Or it'd just be like watching like almost like an FMV game where it's just like cutscenes all the time. Ooh. Alrighty. She knows about her job to remind me. We already have our costume, my costume decided. Hello. Thanks for being here. It's just a quiet little morning. I'm going to read 3 more chapters. I've only been live for 30 minutes. I'm going to read chapters 3, 4, and 5 and call it. Okay. Chapter 3. The Tale is Turned. Open up! The man yelled again, beating hard on the door. I want to talk to you! Bess looked at Nancy, her eyes wide with apprehension. Who could that be? She whispered. Nancy, what'll we do? Nancy felt a shudder tumble through her as she held up her hand to Bess. As she walked toward the door, she heard Ned's voice in the hall. Cool down, Ned said from the other side of the door. Who are you? What do you want? I'm Holt Scotto, that's who. The words blasted through the door. Nancy reached for the knob and opened the door. Scotto was tall, with short hair bleached straw blonde by the sun and a small gold hoop in one ear. His eyes were narrowed as he stared at Nancy. Ned stepped between them in the doorway. With one sweep of his beefy arm, Scotto pushed Ned aside and continued to glare at Nancy. You're the one asking questions at the diner and down at the pier? Scotto said to Nancy. Who are you? What do you want? I'm Nancy Drew. I'm just a friend of Katie Firestone, Nancy said. So that's it, Scotto said. I might have known. Why don't you come in, Nancy said. We can talk in the room. There's no point in disturbing the other guests. I can say my piece right here, Scotto declared. How come you're snooping around town? What's Firestone got to do with you? Her boat was vandalized earlier today, Nancy said. From the corner of her eye she could see Mrs. O'Prey, the innkeeper, hurrying down the hall. I thought maybe one of the fishermen saw something from a boat as he went in or out of the harbor, Nancy said. So someone trashed her boat, Scotto said with a snort. Well, I know what happens next. I get hassled by the sheriff. That's what always happens when little Miss Katie has a problem. His face was dark red, partly from the sun. Nancy guessed, but not completely. He seemed very angry. Hold, Scotto, you get out of my inn, Mrs. O'Prey said. Stop causing such a ruckus, or I will call the sheriff on you. You're bothering my other guests. Now get. Look, Mr. Scotto, perhaps the sheriff contacts you because you seem to be the town leader, Nancy said in a soothing voice. It's clear that the other fishermen look up to you. Sheriff Harvey probably figures there's nothing that happens around here that you don't know about. You're pretty smooth, but I'm not buying it, Scotto said. His mouth clenched tight above his square jaw. You quit poking around. I'm not warning you again. If you mess with me, you'll be sorry. That does it, Ned said, stepping forward toward Scotto. Back off. For a moment, it looked as if Scotto might hit Ned, but Ned folded his arms across his chest and gave the intruder a fierce look. Scotto took a half step back. Then, with one last warning glare at Nancy, he stalked away. Are you okay? Ned asked Nancy. Do you want me to follow him out and make sure he leaves? Maybe we should call Sheriff Harvey, Bess added, her voice low. I'm so sorry, Mrs. O'Prey said. I wouldn't be too worried about Holt. He's got a terrible temper, but his bark's worse than his bite, as they say. He wouldn't really hurt anyone. He's just kind of private. Doesn't like people nosing into his affairs. She gave Nancy and the others a warm smile. Could I get you some tea? Nothing for me, thanks, Bess said. My nerves are jangling enough. Thanks, Mrs. O'Prey. We're fine, Nancy said. The innkeeper bustled off to soothe other guests who'd gathered in the hall. That guy was creepy, Bess said, and Ned stepped in and closed the door. Nancy, are you sure there isn't something we can do? I don't think we need to follow him or call the sheriff, Nancy answered. But he threatened you, Bess protested. Not with anything specific, Nancy said, and he didn't lay a hand on any of us. He just made a lot of noise. If Mrs. O'Prey doesn't want to charge him for disturbing the peace, then we really don't have much of a claim. If he does try something later, at least we'll have a lot of witnesses to tonight's threats. Well, Mrs. O'Prey might think Scotto's just a big blowhard, Ned said, but I'm not so sure. I'm going to call George and tell her what happened, Bess said. She settled down at the little desk and made her call. We really didn't get much information on our trip into town, Nancy said, and pulled out her drawing of the business card fragment. You really think that could be something, don't you? Ned said, nodding at the fragment. I do, Nancy said. I know Katie thought it could have been dropped by one of her whale watchers, but it seems too crisp and clean to have been there very long. You're right, Ned said. It doesn't really look like it's been sitting around a damp boat for a while. If it was dropped by someone who vandalized Katie's boat, then that person may be staying in a motel, Nancy pointed out. That would seem to rule out a local culprit. She checked the telephone book. There's only one place around here that could possibly match this business card, she said, pointing to the name. The Abalone Motel. It's about 10 miles down the coast road. I think I'll run down there tomorrow. Count me out, Ned said. I promise to help rehab the boat. I'll go, Bess said, joining them after her phone call. Just don't forget breakfast at Katie's, Ned said, walking to the door. Tomorrow morning, lobby downstairs, 8:15. Ned reminded them as he left to go to his room. After he left, Bess and Nancy talked a little until they fell asleep. Over eggs and muffins at Katie's the next morning, they talked about the investigation in town and confrontation with Holt Scotto. The fisherman on the pier said the strangest thing, Bess reported. He gave us a goofy warning, saying to enjoy our stay, but be careful of sneakers. What do you suppose he meant? I know exactly what he meant, Katie said. There are these weird waves along this stretch of the coast. They're called sneaker waves. They seem to come out of nowhere with no warning. Hikers and shell collectors get swept right out to sea by them. Are you serious? Ned asked. Deadly serious, Katie said. The locals have a slogan they always tell visitors: stay alert, keep escape routes in mind, and never turn your back on the ocean. So how come you never told us about that yesterday when we were at the beach? George said, poking her friend in the side with her elbow. Because we were in a cove protected by those huge rock formations, Katie pointed out. By the time the waves get to the shore there, they've been cut down by the rocks. Those rocks were something, Bess said. They're so huge, and they rise right out of the ocean. Technically, they're called sea stacks, or just stacks, Katie said. And you haven't seen anything yet. Wait till we go to the place I want to use for kayak training. It has whole hills of rock coming out of the water. One even has grass and wildflowers growing on top of it. There are several that are hollowed out like tunnels and huge, big enough to take my boat through. They sound like fun to explore, George said. You do have to be careful, though, Katie warned. There are sea caves, which are huge, hollowed-out rock formations there also. They're just like land caves, except the floor is just water. They can be pretty spooky inside, just like any cave. Speaking of training, Ned said, finishing his eggs, I'm ready. I still have a lot of work to do on the boat, Katie said. It's a real mess, George added. They even tampered with the engine. I've got to get it fixed, Katie said. It's my income and I need... The ringing phone interrupted her. From where they sat, Nancy and the others could hear Katie's end of the conversation. Well, hello, Mr. Jason, Katie said. I wondered whether you'd be calling again. It's been at least 3 days since I heard from you. Nancy could hear the sarcasm in Katie's voice. No, I haven't changed my mind, Katie said firmly. I like my business just the way it is. I intend to stay independent. There was a brief silence while Katie listened to her caller. No way, Mr. Jason. All right. Andy. There's no need to call me anymore. My decision is final. Thanks. Katie hung up the phone and returned to the table. Andy Jason, she told the others. He owns a small fleet of whale-watching excursion boats up and down the coast. He's been trying to get me to shut down my business and go to work for him, or at least to buy into one of his franchises. You don't want to? George asked. No way, Katie said. Andy Jason's pretty aggressive, though. Doesn't like anyone to tell him no. I think he wants all the whale-watching business from San Francisco to Oregon. Do you ever think he might be doing all this bad stuff to you? George asked. It's one way to get rid of the competition. George has a point, Katie, Nancy said. I did catch him snooping around my boat once, but I don't know. Well, if he's trying to drum me out of business, it won't work, Katie announced. I'll never work for Andy Jason. I like being my own boss because I get to decide when I take tourists out and when I get a day off for kayaking. Speaking of kayaking, Ned repeated. Definitely a one-track mind, Nancy groaned. I was going to say that I could help you with the boat repairs this morning, Katie, Ned offered. I figure the sooner we get the Ripper seaworthy, the sooner we can climb into the kayak cockpits. Wonderful, Katie replied. How about you, George? Are you ready for more work? I'm in for the duration, George said with a lopsided grin. I'm going to the Abalone Motel to check it out, Nancy said, but then I'll report for duty. I'll go keep Nancy company, Bess said, but after that you can count me in too. With all this help, we're bound to be finished soon, Katie said. Thanks a lot, guys. It was nearly noon by the time Nancy and Bess finally left for their drive down the coast. It was a beautiful day. Nancy and Bess had both grabbed sweatshirts, but so far t-shirts and jeans were all they needed in the warm late January sun. Twice Nancy pulled off onto a scenic overlook so Bess could snap a photo of the majestic hills and sea. All I know is, Bess started to say, interrupting herself when she glanced at Nancy. What is it? She asked. What do you see? Bess started to turn around, but Nancy stopped her. No, don't look out the back. Nancy stared into the rearview mirror. You're scaring me, Nan, Bess whispered. She hunched down a little in her seat and then said, Come on, tell me, what are you looking at? Who is it? Bess repeated. Is it Holt Scotto? I'm not sure, Nancy answered. I'm not even sure he's following us, but when I slow down, he slows down. When I drive faster, he picks up speed too. Nancy accelerated up a hill. As she began her descent on the other side, she realized that her car and the one following were the only two on the road for as far as she could see. She glanced at the other car in her mirror. It was a rusty old red Mustang, and it was barreling down the hill toward her. He's coming faster, Nancy said. She felt her breath speeding up too. She pressed down on the accelerator pedal a little harder. She looked up again. The car was charging toward her, filling her rearview mirror. It's end of chapter 3. Be safe on your lurk. Okay. Shall we press on? Chapter 4. Lights Out. The reflection in Nancy's rearview mirror grew larger as the car behind them moved faster. "He's not going to stop," Nancy told Bess. "I've got to get out of the way." With no warning, Nancy turned onto a dirt road leading up into the canyon. She drove as fast as she could up the hilly, narrow road, checking her rearview mirror frequently. When she came to another road branching to the right, she turned onto it. After checking her mirror, she slowed to a stop. Bess turned around to check out the back window. "Did he follow us?" "I don't think so," Nancy said. "I don't think he turned off the coast road, and he definitely wasn't back there to see me take this offshoot." They waited a few minutes, then Nancy backed carefully off the side road onto the main canyon 2-lane. Slowly, she headed back down to the coast road. She scanned both ways a long time before finally pulling out onto it and driving south toward the Abalone Motel. As she drove, she checked the cars along the way, but saw nothing like the rusty red Mustang that had been following them earlier. Finally, they reached the motel, and within minutes, Nancy knew the trip had been for nothing. She held the business card for the Abalone Motel in one hand and the drawing of this card scrap she had found on Katie's boat in the other. "Look," she showed Bess, "they don't match." Nancy couldn't keep the disappointment out of her voice. This was the one possible physical clue they had, and it was a dead end. "Now what?" Bess asked, her pale eyebrows squinched into a frown. "Back to the Ripper," Nancy said with a sigh. As they left the motel, she noticed a poster for Andy Jason's whale watching excursions. "Looks as if he has an office about 20 miles south of here," she told Bess. "Let's take a look." The winding 2-lane road stayed pretty close to the coast, diverting once in a while to run through a small town or by a tiny shopping district. Finally, they came to a boat-shaped building topped with a colorful sign. "See migrating whales up close," the sign read. "Finest fleet afloat. Andy Jason, owner." "Grab your camera, Bess," Nancy said. They stepped inside the building. The nautical theme was carried throughout the interior. A huge anchor lay like a modern sculpture in the center of the room. A receptionist sat at a desk ringed with life preservers hung from a thick white rope. "May I help you?" the young woman said with a toothy smile. "I hope so," Nancy answered. "Is Mr. Jason in by any chance?" "Are you interested in one of our excursions?" the young girl asked. "I can help you with reservations or information." "Actually, I'd like to speak to Mr. Jason," Nancy said. "I'm starting a small weekly newspaper, the Canyon Courier. I'm interviewing local business people for the first issue. Mr. Jason is certainly a mover and shaker in this area, and he should be in the premiere issue, don't you think? I realize I should have called to make an appointment, but starting a paper is just so crazy. There are a million things to do. My photographer and I were driving by, and we thought we'd stop. If Mr. Jason is in, we could do the interview right now." The young girl's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Oh, absolutely," she said. "Just wait right here. Don't move. I'll see if Mr. Jason's available." Nancy fished in her bag for the notebook and pen she always carried. Bess checked her camera. "I've got 2 shots left," she murmured to Nancy. "Make it look good," Nancy whispered as the young receptionist bustled back into the room. She was followed by a slim man in a navy blazer with brass buttons. He looked as if he was in his mid-30s. "So who have we here?" the man said, holding out his right hand. "I'm Andy Jason. I understand you want to talk to me." He was of medium height, with brown hair and a neatly trimmed beard and mustache. "I'm Lenny Lowell," Nancy said, shaking his hand. "Nice to meet you. I'm the publisher of the Canyon Courier. This is my photographer, Jane Cloud." Bess stepped forward with a big smile and shook Jason's hand. "If you have some time now, Mr. Jason," Nancy said, "I'd love to interview you for a feature I'm doing on the business leaders of this area." "Only if you'll call me Andy," Jason said, giving Nancy an admiring glance. "After all, it sounds as if you're going to be a business leader around here yourself. We're almost colleagues." He gestured toward his office. "Can I get either of you anything? How about a soda? I'm having one." "Nothing for me, thanks," Nancy said. "If I could just ask you a few questions, Mr. Jason. I'm sorry, Andy." While Nancy talked, Bess walked slowly around the room, aiming her camera, looking through the viewfinder, and checking the angle of the sunlight as it flowed through the window. She perfectly imitated a professional photographer lining up a shot. "Well, Mr. Jason, Andy," Nancy began, "how long have you been offering whale-watching excursions in this area?" While Andy Jason answered Nancy's steady questions, she studied him. He seemed open and friendly. "I'm in the process of locating here right now," Nancy said. Are you the only whale-watching business in the area? The only one that counts, Andy said. His smile faded and Nancy noticed a sudden abrupt tone in his voice. So you do have competition, Nancy said, egging him on. Not really, Andy said. There's a small outfit north of here owned by a young woman, but she won't be around much longer. He looked out the window and seemed lost in thought for a moment. Really? Nancy asked. Is she going out of business? One way or another, Andy muttered in a low voice. Then he seemed to recover his friendly attitude and smiled quickly at Nancy. I've made the young lady an offer, and I hope she'll be coming to work for me. Then you will be the whale-watching excursion around here, Nancy concluded. Absolutely, Nancy replied. Nancy heard a tough edge in his voice and knew he was very determined. After several more questions, Bess took a couple of photos, and she and Nancy left. What happens when he finds out we're not journalists named Lenny and Jane? Bess asked. I told him the paper was just getting started and the first issue would come out in 2 months. By then he'll probably have forgotten about it. At least we'll be gone, Bess laughed. I didn't like the way he talked about Katie. It sounded kind of creepy. Maybe George was right, and Andy's the one who's been causing all the trouble. Maybe, Nancy agreed. After a quick lunch, Nancy started the drive back up the coast to Seabreak. They had driven only a few miles when Bess suddenly asked Nancy to stop. Oh, look! Bess exclaimed, pointing out the front window. Look at that great old lighthouse! Let's go take a look, Nancy, just for a minute. Nancy peered down the narrow road leading to the shore and the long rock jetty with the lighthouse at the end. We could take a few minutes, she said, turning the car. Well, look at that, she added, pointing to a car parked at the bottom of the narrow, steep road. It was the rusty red Mustang. Nancy parked the car and they walked onto an old boardwalk of abandoned shops. She and Bess took a closer look at the Mustang. It was locked, and the interior was a mess of papers, ropes, tools, and 3 pairs of boots. Nancy wrote the license plate number in her notebook. A few other cars were parked here, too. Nancy saw a family collecting shells down the beach. They were about 100 yards away, as far away as the length of a football field. There was no one else in sight. She hurried to catch up with Bess, who had started toward the old lighthouse. As Nancy picked her way along the rocks to the end of the long jetty, she felt as if she and Bess were completely alone. They finally arrived at the tall structure, which was in pretty bad shape. The paint was faded and peeling. Part of a metal staircase that wound around the outside of the lighthouse had pulled away and drooped precariously above them. The lighthouse was surrounded by a metal fence. Nancy could tell it had been breached by earlier trespassers. Come on, Bess said. She ducked under a huge yellow sign reading Keep Out, through a large hole in the fence, and up to the lighthouse door. All her senses on alert, Nancy followed quickly. The lighthouse door was ajar. The whining scrape of the rust-brown hinges sent a shiver through her as she pulled it open. She shook it off and stepped into a large round room. It took a minute for Nancy's eyes to adjust to the dim light, but when they did, she saw 1 row of windows halfway up the building and another at the top. The light from these filtered down to the lighthouse floor through a thick layer of dust. Bess seemed more cautious inside the lighthouse. Whoa, she exclaimed, frantically grasping at cobwebs in her hair. I don't know what's ickier, the live things we might run into or the dead thing that's making that awful smell. I think it's rotting seaweed or mold or something, Nancy said. It doesn't look like there's been anyone in here for a while. I hope you're right, Bess mumbled. She seemed to hang back, waiting for Nancy to take the lead. Hey, you're the one who wanted to explore, Nancy said. Let's do it. Nancy stepped carefully through the piles of newspapers, driftwood, and other debris littering the floor of the lighthouse. I may have spoken too soon, Nancy said, stopping suddenly. What do you mean? Bess asked. She was following so closely she bumped into Nancy. I'm not sure. Nancy's voice was lowered almost to a whisper. She crouched and looked closely, flashing her penlight around the floor. It looks as if someone has walked through here. Look, damp splotches about the size of a large foot, like someone tramped through here in wet boots. Recently? Bess asked, her voice high. Where do the steps lead? They sort of start here, and they seem to be jumbled, as if someone turned several times and then just stopped over here. Nancy pointed out a group of several damp smudges on the old wooden floor. There was a small closet about a foot from the last smudge. A low shuffling sound rustled from under the door. Nancy picked up a piece of driftwood and crept to the closest door. As she neared it, the sound behind the door became louder, more urgent. Holding the driftwood firmly with one hand, she grasped the knob with the other. Nancy hesitated a moment, her hand on the knob. Bess stood close behind her, holding a large rock she'd found on the lighthouse floor. Raising the driftwood high over her shoulder, Nancy turned the knob and yanked open the door. It's end of chapter 4. Hope you guys are hanging in okay. One more chapter. Chapter 5. The Shadow in the Cypresses. With a loud rustle of its wings, a seagull flapped out of the closet. Startled, Nancy and Bess jumped back as the gull flew past them and out the front door of the lighthouse. Adrenaline coursed through Nancy's body and she gulped. "Yikes!" Bess finally cried. "I was really scared for a minute." She giggled. "When that thing flew out..." She stopped for a moment to gasp in more air. "It was pretty amazing," Nancy agreed. "I had no idea what was making that noise." "The gull didn't seem to be injured or anything," Bess added, "just locked in." "Yeah," Nancy said, her voice lower. "And by whom? It didn't seem to be weak or starving, and obviously it hadn't been trapped for very long." "You saying it was locked in pretty recently?" Bess asked. "Maybe very recently," Nancy said, looking around the room. "Maybe we should leave," Bess said. "After all, the sign did say keep out. Well, we're in here now. Let's check out that view. Come on, there's that staircase." It took them a while to climb to the top of the tower, the equivalent of 6 flights of stairs. Nancy felt a little giddy as they wound around and around the open metal staircase. When they reached the top, they stopped for a minute to catch their breath. Bess started giggling again and couldn't seem to stop. "Don't get me started," Nancy said, laughing. "When that gull flew out, my heart absolutely stopped," Bess sputtered. "Amazing how fast we can move when we're motivated, right?" Nancy stepped from the tiny stair landing out into the small room that surrounded the staircase. "Someone was in here, though," Nancy said. "Probably today. Those smudges were still damp, and they're too big to have been made by the gull. And did you notice the doorknob?" "No, what do you mean?" "The doorknob was clean," Nancy answered. "No dust. Someone has opened it recently." Bess's giggling stopped and a worried frown scrunched up her face. "But it could have been anybody, right? Someone just like us? Someone who wanted to see this gorgeous view?" "Probably," Nancy answered, walking along the worn planks of flooring. The top half of the room was a wall of windows. "Wow! I feel like I can see all the way to Katie's, more than 20 miles away." "It's so beautiful," Bess responded. "It really is worth the climb." For the first few miles along the shore rounded the hills of golden grasses, gently tumbled into the sea. Farther north, the bluffs angled sharply down into the blue-green water. Stacks of rock shot up through the waves in formations that reminded Nancy of the landscapes in sci-fi movies. Nancy checked her watch. "We'd better get back. The others probably expected us before now." As she turned to go back to the staircase landing, Nancy saw a quick flash of yellow in the corner of her eye. She turned to see someone in a yellow rain jacket running away from the lighthouse along the jetty rocks. The person seemed sure-footed, at home, racing along the treacherous rocks. "Someone was here recently," Bess said, looking over Nancy's shoulder at the person in the flapping yellow jacket. Nancy bolted for the staircase and raced down the winding stairs, holding tightly to the railing. She wanted her feet to move fast, but she knew one misstep could send her into a free fall. Nancy and Bess finally reached the bottom of the staircase in the wooden floor. Nancy ran to the lighthouse door and pulled. It didn't budge. Bess ran up behind her. "Don't tell me, Nancy, just don't say it." "Okay, I won't tell you that we're locked in," Nancy said, jiggling the door. "Maybe it's just jammed. Come on, give me a shoulder." They stood side by side, their shoulders against the door. Nancy counted to 3 and they pushed as hard as they could. The door moved a little but didn't open. They pushed again and finally it opened enough for them to wiggle through. Outside, a stack of rocks was leaning against the door. "Do you think the person we saw running away did this?" Bess asked. "Probably," Nancy replied. "And what do you bet he drives a red Mustang?" When they reached their car, the Mustang was gone. Nancy drove quickly to Katie's. By the time they got there, it was late afternoon. "They must still be working on the boat," Nancy said when they found the house deserted. She and Bess headed immediately for the Ripper. "Where have you been?" Ned asked as Nancy and Bess approached the boat. "We were about to file a missing persons report." It's been a strange day, Nancy said, sinking into one of the chairs on the deck. She and Bess told George, Ned, and Katie about their trip to the Abalone Motel, their meeting with Auntie Jason, and their detour to the lighthouse. Let's call Sheriff Harvey, Katie suggested. It sounds as if someone's stalking you, Nancy. I'd rather keep the sheriff out of this right now, Nancy said. She took a large gulp of the soda Katie handed her. Why, Nancy? Katie said. If there's a connection between this guy and the one hassling me, let's get him locked up and out of our hair. I know what the problem is, Bess offered. We were trespassing at that lighthouse, right? Right, Nancy said, and we have no real proof anyone was following us. That's just a hunch. Okay, I'm going back to the house, Bess said, jumping up from her deck chair. Katie, can I use your computer? I'm going to visit the motor vehicles department to see if I can find out whose Mustang that is. Sure, Katie replied. Bess and George left. Nancy and Ned followed Katie below decks to help with the final cleanup. Then they made their way back to Katie's house. Ned was a big help with the engine repair, Katie told Nancy. Now that the cleanup's finished, I'm hoping we can get some kayaking in tomorrow. Jenna should be getting it any time now, and if I know her, she'll be ready to rumble. When they arrived at the house, they found Bess and George talking to a pretty young woman. She had an athletic body and medium blonde hair that shone with pale streaks from the sun. She spoke fast, her words rippling out of her mouth. Jenna, Katie cried, you made it. She clasped the young woman in a warm hug. Did you have any trouble finding the place? Not a bit. Your instructions were perfect as always. Katie introduced everyone. Well, now we're really under the gun, she concluded. Jenna's a champion competitor. Looks like we can't put off the training session any longer. Speaking of champs, George said, tell them what you found out, Bess. 2 words. Holt Scotto, Bess said triumphantly. The Mustang? Nancy murmured. I knew it, Katie cried. That creep, Ned said through gritted teeth. Hello, Jenna said. You're all talking in code. Please fill this poor Seattle alien in. I'm through talking, Ned said, heading for the door. I'm going to find Scotto and deliver a few threats of my own and maybe a few punches. I'm coming with you, Katie said. Her long face was flushed and her graceful jaw clenched. Wait a minute, you two, Nancy called firmly. You can't do that. It would be a huge mistake. But Nancy, Bess said, now we know it was Holt Scotto who locked us in the lighthouse. Actually, we only know that his car was parked near the lighthouse. We didn't see the driver close enough to identify. It could even have been a woman for all we know. But he threatened you last night, Katie protested. He told me not to mess with him, Nancy said. He followed you down the coast, George said. He almost rammed into you. A car like his, Nancy corrected her. I didn't see his license plate until later. This is so frustrating, Katie said. She leaned back against the wall and sank slowly to the floor. I know it is, Nancy said, crouching next to Katie. Be patient. We'll keep an eye on him, and stay on guard, all of you. The whole town must know who we are by now. Over dinner, Nancy and the others told Jenna what had been happening to Katie. I can't believe it, Jenna said, her large gray-blue eyes flashing with anger. Are you sure the boat's okay now? Sure, Ned said, and Katie said she's taking us out tomorrow to an ideal kayak training place. It's pretty rough out there, but it'll make a great workout, Katie said. And it has to be rough for Jenna, she told the others. She's a real dynamo in the cockpit, the best team alternate we've got. Are you sure you have enough rigs for all of us? Bess asked. I do, Katie answered. Ned, George tells me you've done some sea kayaking already. A little, Ned said. I've done a lot of whitewater kayaking. Great, Jenna said, flashing him a warm smile. Bess and I have done some river kayaking too, Nancy said. But nothing real heavy, Bess pointed out quickly. Well, I'll do a refresher course for everyone who wants it before we go out. How about a little biking to prep us for tomorrow? Ned suggested. Good idea, Katie said. Every time I get my bike on the road, it's free advertising. Nothing like flashing Firestone whale watching and my phone number to remind folks I'm in business, especially the ones who are fighting me on that. Count me out, Jenna said. I'm too exhausted from the drive. In fact, I think I'll just finish unpacking the car and then I'll crash. See you all tomorrow? You've got the room at the end of the hall, Katie said. Just put your kayaking gear in the garage. After dinner, Nancy and her friends helped Katie clean up. You know, Katie said, I'm really behind on my paperwork. I think I'll take a pass on the bike ride too and just stay home to get it done. You guys will be okay without me, won't you? Sure, George said. We'll be fine. Great, Katie said, putting away the last clean dish. Bess, the bike you rode yesterday needs cleaning. Take my bike tonight. And everybody change to long pants and sweaters or jackets. It's going to get pretty chilly. Nancy, Ned, Bess, and George changed clothes. Then they grabbed bikes and headed for the bluffs above the Sea Lion nursery. The sun had just set and the sky was the color of ripe cantaloupe. The fog bank was still hundreds of yards away from shore. A few stars dangled in the glowing sky. They dropped their bikes at the head of the wood steps leading down to the beach. George and Bess scrambled down to the water to check the tide pools before it got dark. Nancy and Ned strolled along the bluff top on a little path worn by thousands of walkers and bikers before them. Ahead of them, the path led into the cypress grove known as the Cypress Cathedral. The trees were bent, windswept, and battered. Farther on, they formed a tall arched room of pale gray trunks and dark green needles. Nancy felt a chill of cool air rise up from the sea over the bluff and across the back of her neck. "Whew," she said with a shiver. "Now I know how those trees feel." "Where's your jacket?" Ned said. "I thought you brought it." "I did. It's with my bike. I didn't realize I'd get so chilly so quickly." "I'll get it for you," Ned said, loping back toward the bikes. Nancy kept strolling slowly toward the Cypress Cathedral until she was actually in among the warped and twisted trunks. It became darker the farther she walked, but the air was warmer because the trees served as a windbreak. Finally, she heard Ned's footsteps behind her. "Guess what?" he said, turning around. "I don't need my jacket in here because—" The footsteps stopped and she couldn't see Ned in the dim light. Ned? It was so quiet in the grove. Another reason why they called it a cathedral, Nancy decided. "Ned, I know you're there." But he wasn't. No one was. "I must have been hearing things," Nancy mumbled unconvincingly to herself. She knew Ned would not tease her or try to scare her here, not after all she'd been through that day. She started forward again slowly. Her ears strained to hear every possible crackling of a twig or shuffling of the sandy dirt. Then she heard it again. It was definitely a footstep, several footsteps. Nancy darted to the left between two arched cypress trees. As she turned, she saw the silhouette of someone several yards from her. Nancy wove in and out of the tangled grove as fast as she could maneuver until she reached several braided trunks to use for cover. She could still hear footsteps, but they were farther away. She was nearly out of breath, but she knew that any noise in this silent place would give away her hiding place. She clasped her hand across her mouth and sniffed precious dollops of air through her nose. The footsteps stopped, and the sounds of her own breathing and a distant gull's cry were all she could hear. That's the end of chapter 5. And where I'm going to call it today. Thank you so much for everybody for being here. I really hope that you have a great day today and a great rest of the weekend. Please take care of yourselves. As always, much love from me to you. I'll catch you all very soon, probably Monday. And until then, take care. Bye.